Reassurance on a journey such as we've been on is an important thing to offer. What we want to be able to think together is, yes, there's a restaurant ahead, and by the way, we will be talking a little about food during the course of our time together today. And yes, that we may not find a place of true belonging, but we'll get a better understanding at least of what the questions have been regarding the meaning of life and what philosophers have reflected on with respect to those questions. We've come a long way together. Consider what we reflected on with regard to Kant. Kant oddly claims that the starry heavens above and the moral law within fill him with ever-increasing admiration and awe. But in the midst of that awe regarding the starry heavens above, which ultimately he says we can't fully know in their true nature, what Kant does is offer us the opportunity for a life in which we live by strict moral principles. And some have said that Kant's notion of a strict, austere morality actually makes the world safe for people that are very decent but very dull. That's one of the criticisms made of him. And in fact, that partly engendered the romantic reaction to Kant. And those romantics who saw Kant as living in a world of austere morality, trying to suppress the passions, those romantics emphasized imagination. They emphasized trying to discover and find a way to express our inner nature and to find an integrity and a wholeness for the person. And always in the back of their minds was not so much being decent and dull, certainly not being dull, but finding a way to be creative. And most recently, we have looked at Hegel, who has given us a grand vision, a kind of bubble that Hegel saw the world living in, and a wonderful, wonderful bubble that for him meant the end of history. And the vision Hegel offered as to how to determine the meaning of life was that we could understand through our imagination, we could recapitulate and see a narrative that told us the grand way in which history had unfolded. And though we ourselves may not have made a specific contribution to that unfolding, we could nonetheless experience what it was like. And we can say, yes, we've seen what history has meant. And Hegel also counseled as a young philosopher that we should live wholeheartedly a passionate life, not an austere moral life. And we wouldn't necessarily have to be those creative, romantic type people who lived in garrets, who embraced all kinds of odd things in the name of creativity. We could live a passionate life in which we embraced conflicts. We lived through them. Even if they were for us agonizing, we could embrace fully life to its fullest. And even as the individuals we are, not perhaps part of the whole of history or its meaning, we could have a full life. And then as we saw just a few lectures ago, later Hegel talks about being the solid citizen. And the notion of being just, is that all he meant? A solid citizen gets powerful reactions against it. Let's continue on our journey. We've looked at two models of philosophical guidance and some of the specific advice that they've offered. And each has a bearing on the present, on the time in which we now live. And they've turned out to have very unexpected consequences. And each has influenced the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, whom we'll be talking about now. Kant had divided the world into appearance and reality, and in dividing the world into appearance and reality, he thought he'd brought faith and reason together. On the one hand, our reason could tell us the structure of how things appear, and faith, though a very austere moral faith as we saw it, could give us an idea of what reality is like. Now, our concern should not just be historical and concern what people once said, we should also look into the present. And we know the progress of science in our time has been thought by many to crowd faith out. It has been thought by many to make a sense of faith less comfortable to hold on to. The technological extension of knowledge that allows us to do with the world what we want, various medical advances in physics, has suggested to us that we may know actually how the world is. And does that leave room for faith? That has been a question. Does the extension of knowledge put us in a position where knowing more and more, no mystery remains? Once knowledge, or was it superstition, could allow us to have a sense of conforming, maybe only through faith, but conforming to the nature of things. And out of that arose the notion that perhaps if we conformed, if we had obedience, that we had faith in a nature of things beyond us, well, maybe we would be protected. And maybe even if we had that connection with a reality beyond us, perhaps only through faith or a strange wisdom we couldn't explain, we might be transformed. It's different in our time. Knowledge has come to be construed as an instrument that gives us power over things and the ability to bend them to human purposes. And such progress and success, well, in many minds that has diminished religious interest or the sense of the plausibility of the religious consciousness. Has the room for faith been crowded out by recent developments in knowledge? Let's consider further. Kant promotes what might be thought of as two-worldly living based on the limitations of reason. Science allows us to master appearances. Reality is reserved for us as an object of faith. But as we've seen, Kant promotes wonder through his conception of our metaphysical nature. We can't help but wonder about the nature of things. But he also wants science to go forward too. What Kant suggests then is that maybe we're two people. On the one hand, a person who can wonder. On the other hand, a person who is caught up very much in scientific investigation. But in the midst of all that, Kant is very concerned about the origin and the destiny of the universe in which we live. He is very concerned about our place in the totality of things, and he leaves open questions regarding our place in the universe. He even leaves open questions about the limits of the universe. He reiterates that it is the inescapable nature of our reason that we do, and we must speculate. So let's pause for just a moment and think about this. Let us pause and reflect. Kant had said that through reason and science, we know how things must appear, but he left room for a sense of faith and wonder, a sense that, yes, there are starry heavens above, there's a moral law within, and somehow out of that could come a sense of faith. But now if we look into our present and the sense in which in our present we could find meaning by, on the one hand, having rational investigation, and on the other hand, beyond our rational investigation, a sense of wonder, in our time with the advance of science, it seems to be the case for some that the room for wonder has become less. Kant's notion that you could hold a life of science and a life of wonder and awe in the universe together has become for many more difficult, far more difficult, because science supposedly has extended further and made less and less of reality mysterious. This is where Schopenhauer comes in to our consideration. Let us consider further. Schopenhauer's importance arises out of his conception of what our contact with reality actually is. And there's one particular place that Schopenhauer finds our contact with reality direct and revelatory. And that's through our own bodies. Now that's quite a significant departure in philosophy. There have been three very strong aversions in philosophy to regarding the body as the place of access to reality. We get from Socrates and Plato the notion that after all our body is a kind of prison or a fortress, and ultimately we will hope to escape from it. And from Augustine and all kinds of people in a more ascetic tradition, we get the notion that what the body does is lead us into temptations, and that our bodies are places where desires team up, that distract us, that draw us away. And also we find in philosophy a movement that begins, let us call it in the 17th century, and what it has to do with is a bifurcation of us, a split in us between, on the one hand, our minds, our consciousness, which supposedly is very problematically connected with our materially determined bodies. And the stress among these philosophers is to talk about the mind, not the body, to try to disconnect the mind from the body as far as reflecting on it is concerned, and consider primarily, if not altogether, the mind. Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher who did most of his work in the 19th century, gives a very precise account of our direct experience of our bodies. I'd like you to do something for me. Lift your arms up. Schopenhauer would tell us that in that very experience that you've just undergone, you've had a direct experience with reality, that our knowledge of reality actually is internal to us. It's non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational, and it doesn't involve our senses. What Schopenhauer says is that we directly experience in our movements. We don't even think about our movements as we make them. We just make them. That very making of our movements is an experience in which we are one with reality. Now, it is true that sometimes, not often, but sometimes we could say, I'm going to decide to get a glass, and I can walk across a room and get a glass. And then there's something like my will involved, and then perhaps I walk across the room and pick up a glass. But normally, we just make movements, and they're part of us. And for Schopenhauer, that's what reality really is. And that experience of reality that we have through our natural movements, through our experience with our bodies, might best be construed as energy. That what we are experiencing thereby is energy. And regarding ourselves, this knowledge of our bodies is unique, and we don't make inferences. It's non-inferential. We just have that experience. We live it. We're not spectators of it. We can look at things around us, but when I move around, I'm living, not simply looking. And Schopenhauer gives us something that can be a cause of great concern, and it will concern us greatly as we move forward, because Schopenhauer says that not only in the movement of our body do we experience reality, but we have direct knowledge in what we do of a lot more than acts of will. What we experience directly as part of ourselves are our emotions, our moods, our desires, our cravings, our fears, and our strivings. They're also made evident to us. And now we verge on what I had mentioned before as Schopenhauer's pessimism. Because just as we directly experience the movement of our bodies in various ways, what we experience with our moods, our desires, our feelings, is that they're incessant. They're multiple, they're tangled, they're urgent, and they're often conflicting. Pause for a moment and think about this. Is it not the case that you directly experience all kinds of desires, urges, feelings, and emotions pulsing through you? Isn't this something that's a very fundamental part of your experience? And Schopenhauer says it is, and it is our access to and our experience of what reality is actually like. Schopenhauer's notion is that reality is actually something that he calls the will. But this is a very unfortunate and a misleading term for Schopenhauer, because what Schopenhauer means by the word will is a blind, rationally inaccessible force that's a kind of primitive energy itself. This energy, he thinks, manifests itself in and through everything. And it's best revealed because only thinly veiled in its manifestation in us. And he thinks that this energy is impersonal, insatiable, and in us it's a source of considerable suffering. A strange view of what reality is. So far, we have at least wanted to think of reality as something that is beyond normal things that might transform us. In Schopenhauer reality, which we are in contact with, which we have an avenue to directly through our bodies, our moods, our feelings, our desires, it's a pulsing something that in fact causes us, on Schopenhauer's view, great suffering. Socrates talks to a man called Cephalus in one of Plato's dialogues. And Cephalus says what is important is actually to escape desires, somehow to get beyond them. Because if you can get beyond your desires, what in fact happens is you have tranquility, you have peace of mind. Your desires are not viewed so much as opportunities as distractions. This is the sort of view that Schopenhauer develops. Because if we're to believe Schopenhauer, after you satisfy your cravings and desires, you have a brief respite. But typically, then you become bored, and you have in your satiation a sense of emptiness. But maybe that's even the best story to be told, because Schopenhauer says that unsatisfied desires, and most of our desires are unsatisfied, well, that's painful. Because most of our desires are seldom satisfied satisfactorily. And the satisfactions of our desires, the acting on our emotions and feelings, often has very unfortunate and painful consequences. They're kind of important and, I think, significant comparative connections with the tradition of philosophy that kind of puts Schopenhauer's philosophy in highlights and perspective. Kant had this notion of imagination and a notion of will and willpower, and that has intriguing forebearers. We see in Plato the notion that deep within us is something Plato calls eros, best understood as desire, and that we have an underlying desire in us, and that desire, whether we realize it or not, is always to be and never not to be. Schopenhauer talks about something that looks a great deal like what Plato calls eros and understands as the desire always to be and never not to be, except for Schopenhauer. that underlying desire is actually a craving for satisfactions, many of which are not achieved, many of which cause pain, and those which are achieved lead to boredom. Schopenhauer's view is nearly the opposite of the view that we see in Hegel. Hegel had that notion, has that notion, offers that notion of the human spirit as a fusion of reason and imagination, reason and passion, and out of that comes considerable energy and celebration of life. Schopenhauer says, no. What Hegel is talking about, well, that's grand to think. It's a very cozy notion. It's a way of celebrating oneself, perhaps. Perhaps even, and we'll come to this, it's the sort of thing that a professor in Berlin with a chair in philosophy might want to say. But for Schopenhauer, what is celebrated as spirit by Hegel, what is thought of in Plato as an underlying desire always to be and never not to be, is really a pulsing, irrational force that wells up in us. And we get glimpses of it and of its promise, which is very little, and the way it burdens us, which is very great, through our experience of our so-called inner lives, which we have access to. Let's consider further. Schopenhauer holds a view that is at best pessimistic. If it is really true, and the world is a world in which we are, yes, victims of our underlying desires, where they are a burden to us, well, where did that come from? Why should Schopenhauer have held such a view? Many say, we can ask whether it's fair to Schopenhauer. We can even ask whether it's fair to any consideration of the meaning of life. Many ask whether it's caught up in Schopenhauer's own circumstances. They're claimed by many to illuminate why he's such a pessimist. And they suggest that his pessimism has grown out of his underlying disposition. He had a very dismissive and dismissively distant relation to the official philosophical establishment. And I suppose we can't quite take that lightly. It helps us to understand his outlook and how to regard philosophy perhaps as a guide to living. Schopenhauer felt himself in competition with Hegel. Very briefly, Schopenhauer had a position in Berlin, teaching in the same institution as Hegel, and maybe even perversely, what Schopenhauer did was to schedule his courses at the very same time that Hegel's courses were offered. Nobody came to Schopenhauer's classes, or we have little record of very many coming and very few staying, and Hegel's classes were overloaded with people. Maybe that's human nature. If it turns out that somebody is celebrating the life of the Spirit, and the meaning of life means enjoying the Spirit and understanding it, maybe that draws a better crowd than an account of philosophy in which what you're doing is saying there's a force that wells up in you, it is always there, it gnaws at you, it is always victimizing you because it wants more and more. If you get what you want, you get bored. If you get what you want, it might be a painful experience, but usually you don't get what you want. We'll have to say, it's another controversial point, that at very best, Schopenhauer has a very complex and, in fact, unfortunate attitude about women, and it comes through in his writings. For one thing, he says women shouldn't be allowed in the theater. That's because they wouldn't understand what was going on there. He also says that women, they really are seductresses. You've got to be careful about women because they're always out to make you the father of their children. That's their goal in life. And Schopenhauer does give them considerable credit as mothers. He says they're very good with children. But the reason he says they're very good with children is because they're children themselves and never becomes more than that. Schopenhauer's mother was a very, very close friend, an intellectual friend, with Goethe, the philosopher, political theorist, the scientist and writer Goethe. And at one point, Schopenhauer's mother wrote her son Schopenhauer a letter and said, "Get lost." Well, she didn't quite put it that way. She happened to be in Weimar, Germany, where Goethe and some of the celebrated figures of the day were, and she was writing popular things that were selling. Well, Schopenhauer came around for a while, but he got on his mother's nerves. He got in the way of her life there. And she said, "I hope I never have to see you again." Notice that I've just mentioned she was a popular writer. What I haven't mentioned, and have saved for this moment to tell you, is that Schopenhauer published one major work in 1818. It was called The World as Will and Idea. It seemed nobody bought it or read it. Schopenhauer didn't write for decades because he said, "I've said how things are in that work. Why should I write something more? I've said how things are, and if people aren't going to listen to it, too bad." Here is Schopenhauer's mother, a very popular writer, who has told him that he's irksome, and she just wishes he was completely out of her life. He's written a book that nobody reads. He ends up living in Frankfurt, Germany, doing no more writing for a long time. Let me move us slightly now toward the point of turn. Schopenhauer believes that reason is impotent and stresses the importance of coming to terms with those underlying energies that pulse through us. And reason, which Kant celebrated, which Hegel celebrated, Schopenhauer says it's a blind, unwitting instrument of this underlying energy, this thing that Schopenhauer calls the will. And Schopenhauer actually says that our rational consciousness is just kind of an arena that gets created by the will for the will's activity. And Schopenhauer tells us that history doesn't have a rational direction. History is just things happening, and they happen because this will that we experience through us, but is at work everywhere, just keeps pulsing to express itself and to satisfy itself. About ultimate reality, Schopenhauer is very agnostic. He makes virtually no claims about ultimate reality. He says things of the sort, well, thousands of years passed before any of us were born. Likely an eternity is going to pass after we die. We discover ourselves here in the world. We've got these fancy philosophical types who are telling us that we can celebrate the human spirit. They're telling us that we can learn to conquer our desires through reason. They tell us that we can be creative spirits and outsiders, remove ourselves from the urban, the industrial. We can learn to express ourselves and be creative. That's all fine and good. And they talk about the difference between the mind and the body. That's all fine and good. But just let yourself experience your life. Come down off the high pedestal of professional philosophy and think about how you want food, want experience, want excitement. Sometimes it comes to you, sometimes it doesn't. When your desires are met, they're usually not met comfortably. Most of your desires aren't met at all, so you suffer. You're always in a state of tension because of suffering, because of desire. As we'll look at a little further in our next lecture, Schopenhauer comes to wonder whether Buddhism has something to offer to our human predicament of being caught up in desires that are always pressing on us and always haunting us. Schopenhauer may have been the first major philosophical thinker to bring Buddhistic thinking to the West, a kind of thinking that's more concerned to separate us from our desires than to satisfy them. Well, perhaps that's an avenue we can look into. But if Schopenhauer's account of how the world is right, what does he think we can do? This pessimistic account of reality is not reason, but a pulsing underlying energy that victimizes us. What are our options? How might we find a cure? What does Schopenhauer think we can do?